As the pressure mounts on Daniel Levy after Tottenham's disappointing result at Newcastle, it's revealed that he has made yet another decision that makes him look like he cares more about money than he does about the fans. Meanwhile, in contrast, I'll be discussing how surprised I was to see where Spurs sit in the net spend table of the Premier League, and Liverpool make their first moves to tie down their world-class stars. But are Real Madrid and Saudi Arabia circling? All this and more on today's episode of Daily Premier League News with me, Barnaby Slater. Guys, thank you so much for watching and for listening. Please do press that like button. Please do press subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. And please do go over to the podcast platforms if you want to listen to this while, say, you're running, you're out and about, or you're driving. Just go to the Spurred On podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Give us a subscribe or follow there too. But let's get started. And as I mentioned in the opening, Daniel Levy once again not understanding the optics whatsoever, because according to Matt Law, Tottenham are believed to be among only 3 clubs, or certainly not many more than 3 clubs, who have been opposed to the new European ticket price caps. Basically, what has happened is that UEFA have agreed with a number of the clubs who are in Europe this season to an absolute price maximum for fans to go home and away during the Europa League, the Europa Conference League, and the Champions League, and Daniel Levy has opposed it. Now, as you'll know, regular viewers and regular listeners to my channel, I try to be quite pragmatic and subjective and just not reactive when it comes to Daniel Levy and ENIC and a lot of the negativity around him. But I have to say, on this one, he just does not help himself, does he? Like I said, I stick up for Levy and ENIC a fair bit because I think in general they have grown the club to a place where we are regularly talked about as a top 6 club. We got to a Champions League final. We've challenged for Premier Leagues. Yes, there's been a lack of trophies and that's very disappointing. But I have tried to be fair where I can be. But in terms of this, what is he doing? What is he playing at? Why is he suggesting that there shouldn't be this price cap when there's a cost of living crisis? Everyone is struggling. There's so much unemployment. And just times are hard. Energy bills are massive. And he should be looking at this from the fans' point of view, from the fans' perspective. And also, I just think, not only that, but as somebody who has made so many errors that have upset the fans, why does he never seem to try and take an opportunity to rebuild some kind of relationship with those fans? I have to say, I think it's disappointing. And for equality, I do feel like this is a good time for me to kind of go into some of what are the perceived mistakes that Daniel Levy and ENIC have made over the past few years. Just because, like I said, I don't really see a lot of other chairmen or owners of clubs that I would rather have in. I don't see any where I'm like, you know, I want to be owned by a state, or I want to be owned by an oligarch, or I want to be owned by Clearlake and Todd Bowley. But it is worth for transparency and showing an equalness to this argument. It's worth going through some of these perceived mistakes that Levy and ENIC have made. So obviously there was the 2 transfer windows without signings. I've discussed this before. I do feel like the stadium build was as much, if not more. In fact, it was basically responsible for that. And as I've said, I think Levy needed to come out and say that the stadium build wouldn't affect our ability to make transfers, but it obviously did, and it obviously was always going to. But also the argument back then was also kind of everyone was saying, who can Spurs buy to improve that first team? Because we had such a strong first team. Well, since then, Danny Rose has come out as a good example and given an interview that I heard where he said all the players in the changing room were saying we just need 1 or 2 more extra players to really push us to that next level. World-class players to kind of add to the brilliant melting pot we had. So that was disappointing. But in terms of it being a mistake for me, Nick and Levy, yeah, I think you can look at it and say it was a mistake not to buy extra players at that time, but I just think the money wasn't there. Next up, sacking Maurizio Pochettino. I cried, I admit it. I cried when Maurizio Pochettino was fired. I remember exactly where I was, and it was gutting. I don't think he should have been sacked. He had done enough to deserve more time, and it was a mistake. However, I should also caveat that by saying, and people need to remember this, Maurizio Pochettino was touting himself about for other jobs. He wanted the Manchester United job. And I think if that had come up at the right time for him, he would have angled to go and get that. He felt he'd taken Tottenham as far as he could. He'd talked about the painful rebuild. And I'm not 100% sure that Pochettino at that point wanted to stick around for the kind of 2 or 3 years it would have taken for that painful rebuild. What I would have chosen to have done if I was Daniel Levy is I would have sat down with Maurizio Pochettino and said, look at Diego Simeone at Atletico Madrid. He's taken that team to Champions League finals, but then he's known he's had to rebuild, and there have been a season or two each time of not finishing as high up the league. But then they came back and they won the Primera Division in the Premier. What is it in Spain? Anyway, the top league in Spain. They won that, and Simeone is still there. And I would have loved Pochettino to be our legacy manager and still be our manager right now. But I'm just not sure whether Pochettino felt like he had the motivation to stick around for those rebuilds necessarily, and he certainly didn't see the motivation from Daniel Levy and ENIC to get rid of the players it would have taken to get rid of and bring in young players to do that rebuild. That is happening now. So yes, I see it as a mistake from ENIC and Levy to sack Maurizio Pochettino, but there was a caveat there. Next one, replacing Pochettino with a win now manager, Jose Mourinho. I was on the Mourinho train at the beginning, of course I was, but as all the pundits said, it's all well and good when you're winning games to have that style of football where you're playing defensively, hitting teams on the break and nicking results. But when it goes wrong, when you stop winning those games, the fans have nothing to fall back on and the pressure mounts, and that's exactly what happened with Mourinho. And I have to say I would add the win now manager choice of Antonio Conte into that as well. Once again, I thought it was a great appointment. I thought he was going to bring us guaranteed success. But the reality was, appointing win now managers for Daniel Levy did not fit with the amount of money Levy was willing to spend to create success for those managers. Those managers, Mourinho and Conte, the success they've had in English football have been at clubs, Chelsea specifically, but also Manchester United, Mourinho's case, where they are willing to spend top dollar on wages and transfer fees to get players who are at the very top of their game, who have won all the trophies. And the reality was Levy was not willing to back his managers that way. And therefore, getting those types of managers was not it was not the right strategy at the right time with the right people and the right amount of investment. So that was a mistake as well. Let's go on next to furloughing club staff during lockdown. Once again, just a terrible look optics-wise from Daniel Levy. Terrible, terrible look. A big mistake, and one he had to row back on almost immediately when he saw the reaction from both the press and Tottenham Hotspur fans. We can add to that the Super League. Now, I'll add a caveat to the Super League one. It was a mistake to get in bed with people who were trying to set up a closed shop league where people couldn't get promoted and relegated. That was the big mistake. However, I will caveat it by saying I think if the Super League had been announced and Spurs weren't involved in it, and then the Super League had happened, I think Spurs fans would have used that as a stick to beat Daniel Levy with, saying, you're not showing Spurs as a big enough club. You've done all this stuff saying you're doing this to grow Spurs into a big club, but you haven't even got in with the Super League that's now gone ahead without us. So I can see almost why he wanted to get involved in it. I can see why he wanted to be in the top level conversations. And of course, I can see why Daniel Levy saw it as a cash cow, an opportunity to make more money for the club. But he should have worked hard and fought hard against it being a closed shop. And that is why it ended up being stopped and ended so soon. But it hasn't gone away, and it will come back up. And at some point, the Super League will happen. And the reality is, as Spurs fans, and let me know how you feel in the comments, but as Spurs fans, when that Super League happens, you will want Tottenham to be in that Super League. Trust me. But I do think it's an ugly, grotty situation where they're trying to break away just for money's sake. But at some point, the Super League will replace the Champions League, just in the same way that the Champions League replaced the old European Cup. That was because the biggest clubs were complaining about the amount of money they were getting, and that's what changed the Champions League, what came as the Champions League from the European Cup. Back in the day, the European Cup was only the champions of each country. But because of the big clubs wanting more money, the Champions League came about, and that's why at first it started with the top 2, then the top 3, now the top 4, and even possibly the top 5 getting in the Champions League, depending on your coefficient. Next up, Levy's mistakes. I personally don't think this was a huge mistake, but let me know in the comments because I'm sure lots of you will disagree. Sacking Jose Mourinho before the League Cup final. Jose Mourinho now talks about how basically he was guaranteed to win that League Cup final. Our form was appalling. Our football was appalling. Could Jose Mourinho have wangled it against Man City at Wembley? Yeah, possibly. But I can see why Daniel Levy chose to sack him, because if Mourinho had won that game, he would have given himself at least another year of grace. And the form, like I said, and the style of football that was being played was horrible. And I think Daniel Levy realised that he was stuck between a rock and a hard place. But that doesn't mean I don't understand those of you who are big Mourinho fans and just want a trophy and think a kind of League Cup would have answered all the prayers and got everyone off our back in terms of trolls. I do understand why you would see that as a mistake, sacking him. Then, putting the recruitment in the hands of Fabio Paratici. Now, Paratici, undoubtedly a good deal maker. Undoubtedly, he's got an eye for a player. And some of the signings, particularly Udogi, is the one that sticks out. Vicario, some of those signings are great. I'm really happy with those signings. However, to put all your recruitment in the hands of someone who is then seen to have basically been a criminal, to be banned from football. Again, Daniel Levy just showing that his decision-making often, the optics are just so terrible. And, you just think, don't you, automatically, as a fan of a football club that's like one of the highest revenue-making companies in the country almost, you think that everyone at the top must know what they're doing and must be able to make good decisions all the time, but just shows how easy it is to make bad decisions. Then, because of Paratici trying to appoint Gennaro Gattuso as our manager, who had made very inappropriate comments about women and gay people, etc., etc., and then having to row back on that, and then once you didn't appoint Gattuso because you had to row back on it because the fans were protesting, settling on Nuno Espirito Santo, a dead man walking, someone who from the first moment kind of knew he wasn't the first choice as manager. And of course that only lasted a few months. And then finally, in terms of the ones from the last few years that I can think of, putting Christian Stellini in charge when he sacked Antonio Conte and appointing that man as caretaker who's so out of his depth that then he had to sack the caretaker to put in charge another caretaker in Ryan Mason. So all of these decisions, even though, like I said at the start, I don't see Daniel Levy and ENIC as the terrible devils that a lot of people do. I don't see them as bloodsuckers. I don't think they're taking money out of the club to line their pockets, other than Daniel Levy has a very high wage. I do understand that. But I don't see them being like the Glazers, for instance, like really blood-sucking the money out of the company for their own benefit. I do see them wanting to sell the company, wanting to sell Tottenham Hotspur at some point and making a big profit from what they paid for the club back in 2000, 2001 or whenever it was. But that's just business. But what I will say is, in terms of those decisions and those optics, just some really terrible decision makings, really appalling. And I have to say it as it is, that needs to improve. Daniel Levy will never kind of grow in terms of reputation amongst the Spurs fans while he makes decisions like that. And in terms of the European ticket prices, he should absolutely be fighting for a cap for our fans. He should want to have as many of our fans in the stadium as possible. Let's not make it a tourist trap. Let's get the atmosphere up, because that will give us the biggest chance of achieving what I genuinely believe he actually wants, which is to win trophies. I believe that. But at the moment, it just seems like some other decisions, including money, seems to come to the forefront of his mind when the big decisions have to be made. Okay, on to some more Spurs news. Real Betis president Angel Haro has confirmed that Spurs have obtained the option to buy Johnny Cardoso, their defensive midfielder, at a fixed price as part of that Gio Lo Celso deal. The option for Cardoso is worth £21 million, and the window for Spurs to activate that option is only 2 weeks long and is at some point in 2025. You've got to assume the beginning of the transfer window, 2025. Have you guys seen much of Cardoso play? Let me know if you have in the comments below. Do you think he'd be a good signing? Is he possibly the number 6 that so many Spurs fans have been crying out for and feel like is a vital part of the Ange Postecoglou strategy and style of play that we're not quite getting at the moment? Meanwhile, some more news. Alfie Deine is flying to Belgium today as he's going to wrap up a season-long loan at Westerlo, which is where Luka Vuskovic, our centre-back young starlet, is playing. So that'll be good for them to play together in Westerlo. As I mentioned at the top, the net spend table over the past 5 years in the Premier League is as follows. Chelsea at the top, £832 million. Bear in mind, this is net spend, so money spent minus money recouped. Manchester United second, £547 million. Arsenal third, £469 million. And Spurs in fourth, £458 million. Now, maybe you're wondering, where are Manchester City in that list? Well, the reality is, although Manchester City, of course, spent huge amounts of money, £100 million signings on the likes of Jack Grealish and Gvardiol, for instance. But the amount of money they get in, especially for their academy players, is enormous. Think about Cole Palmer going out for like 50, 60 million pounds. So net spend is not as huge for them. And that net spend for Spurs, putting them in fourth place at £458 million, includes purchasing the likes of Solanke, Richarlison, Brennan Johnson, Christian Romero, and James Maddison. So those of you who say Enoch and Daniel Levy don't spend money, let me know in the comments how you feel about that. Is it about us not actually spending money? The money has been spent. It really looks that way over the last 5 years. Is it about the way the money has been spent? I think it is, but I do think that's improving. I think all the signings we're making at the moment are built for us to have a title challenge in the next 2 or 3 seasons, hopefully, when Manchester City drop off a cliff, Pep leaves, and hopefully some of those charges get brought to fruition, really. I'll talk a little bit more about that later when it comes to the wider Premier League news because of what's happened at Leicester. Meanwhile, Lucas Bergvall has given an interview, got some quotes there which I think are worth bringing to you. On the choking incident that he had in one of his early games at Spurs, he said the following. Firstly, my boot, broke completely. It just opened. So I took a caffeine chewing gum to get started a bit after that. I forgot to take out the gum, and it went into my throat. It was hard to breathe. It never felt like there was anything dangerous. It was more a little uncomfortable. I tried to bring it up, but I was calm. It looked a little worse than it was and felt. He added it was a little uncomfortable. It was a little hard to breathe. That was probably what caused a slight panic. I took the gum to get a little extra boost. It's probably a bit of a placebo effect too. I use it a little now and then if I might feel I need a little more tired, if I might feel a little more tired some days. If you want a little extra energy, but it's not something I want to get used to. As I said, it's probably mostly a placebo thing. So as he said, looked worse than it was, but I know a lot of people in the stadium were a bit panicked by that. Meanwhile, he talked a little bit about his expectations in terms of coming to Spurs from Sweden. Lucas said, I don't know what my expectations were before, to be honest. I came into a tough but fun pre-season. It was very new. I just wanted to start playing football again after the holiday break. The only thing I knew was that it would be tough. It was a motivation when I came to a new league with new people, new teammates, new coaches, new facilities, diet, training, physical activity, everything. It feels like I've taken very big steps these past 2 months. That I get into it more and more and have been able to adapt more to the game that is played in the Premier League. The quality of the players and the teams you face, it's incredible quality everywhere. It's not possible to make that many mistakes or any mistakes at all. You must always be ready. This is the case regardless of where you play, but now it can be punished a little bit easier. He was then asked about when Vicario shouted at him for making that mistake on the right-hand side during the Leicester game where we gave up a chance in the last minute. He said, sometimes you do slightly worse things, sometimes you do better things. We were 1-0 up with a fairly comfortable lead. We conceded at 1-1 and then that happens. He said, all is calm now. Me and Vicario talked about it. He said that there are hot feelings and that things like that happen. So I think a fairly grounded interview from Bergvall. I really love him, as you will have heard me talk about a lot. I think it's very exciting that we've got such a talented young player at the club, as well as Archie Gray as well. And I'm really excited to see him play, probably in that Carabao Cup game against Coventry away. I'd expect him to start there, which, by the way, is only 2 days after the North London derby. Spurs have a really busy fixture list after the international break. But I'd expect Lucas Bergvall to start in that and in some of those Europa League games that come soon after. Speaking of which, Spurs have announced ticketing details for the Europa League games, starting with the home fixture against Qarabağ. Tickets for that fixture will be priced at £30 because of that price cap, with juniors under 18s being able to get in for £10. Some indirect Spurs news. Maurizio Pochettino, who I mentioned a lot, obviously, at the beginning of this episode, he is finally signing in as the US national team head coach this week. There was a verbal agreement weeks ago. All those topics have been resolved in terms of the legals. And as we know, Pochettino doesn't have an agent. He deals with his own contract negotiations and those of his coaching staff. So that's probably why it's taken a little bit longer. And some more indirect Spurs news. Real Betis approached Christian Eriksen and Man United as a last-minute target on deadline day, but no deal was reached. Also, it looked like Eriksen might go to Ajax, but that didn't happen either, despite being heavily linked with his former club. I've said it a lot over the summer. I would have liked Eriksen to come to Spurs as a kind of backup to James Maddison, but it feels like they've been happy enough with Lucas Bergvall there, so that was not approached. Okay, guys, before I get into the more wider-ranging Premier League news, please do, once again, if you haven't already, press that like button. Really helps me get the video seen by more people. Press subscribe. So close to 11,000 subs now, guys. Just 50 to go. So please do press that subscribe button. And if you think there are other people in your friends or family who would like this daily content, please let them know against the channel. Let them know about the channel. Spread the word. I really appreciate it. And you can be a member, just £1 a month. All the details of how in the description box below. Okay, let's start at Manchester United. Galatasaray apparently in talks with Man United to loan Casemiro for a season. Now, I talked yesterday about Galatasaray getting Victor Osimhen and how that might affect Spurs in the Europa League, and if they get Casemiro as well, it'll be a real it'll be more of a test, I think. Casemiro got a lot of abuse after his performance against Liverpool in the at the weekend, where he was taken off at half-time, replaced by a debutant for Man United. Meanwhile, Manuel Ugarte, Man United's big new signing from PSG, has given his first quotes. He was asked why he joined United. He said, firstly, being a part of where so many legends of football have played, and I'd love to experience United's legendary stadium and feel the presence of supporters. He was asked why it took so long to join. He said, this club, this stadium is legendary. I was willing to wait as a result. We all know what a massive club United is, one of the best teams in the world. It's a dream come true to join United. I'm really happy because it's been a very long process. Well, United are in the mud at the moment. Ten Hag getting pelters from everywhere, and they need Ugarte to be, an incredible player and really, start strongly from the beginning, because they are weak at the moment. They've had 2 losses in their first 3 games. Their sporting director Dan Ashworth was talking about the transfer window. He says there are always bits where you go, if only I could have done that, or if only I could have got that over the line. So they clearly don't feel like they did all the business they wanted. As I mentioned in the opening of this video, over to Liverpool, and they are opening contract talks with Mohamed Salah after he said at the weekend during an interview on Sky that this would be his last season at the club following their win against Man United. There's some debate as to whether he meant that literally or whether he meant he was in the last year of his contract. But personally, I think it's looking likely, and I could be wrong, that both him, Trent Alexander-Arnold and Virgil van Dijk are seriously looking at their options, maybe looking at potential moves to Spain for Trent Alexander-Arnold with Real Madrid, or Saudi if you're Mohamed Salah. Let's see what happens. Over to Man City, Kevin De Bruyne talked about how his contract is also due to expire in June. He said, once the season goes on, I'm sure there'll be talks. I just want to feel good, play good football, and this will come in the upcoming months. I don't really feel the rush for the moment. Can you see Kevin De Bruyne going to Saudi Arabia as well? I'm sure they'll try and break the bank to make that happen. Over at Chelsea, as ever, laughing stock. Chelsea are open to allowing Ben Chilwell, who's such a brilliant left-back, admittedly injury-prone, but they're open to allowing him to go on loan to Turkey for the season. Otherwise, he faces at least 4 months in the footballing wilderness. Meanwhile, Chelsea's ex-player Emmanuel Petit was asked what he thought of the current state of the club. He said, it's becoming ridiculous. The fact that they have so much money. I'm happy for them. Honestly, I'm happy. But the way you spend it, come on, we're not in an American sport. It's Europe. There are rules. So Emmanuel Petit digging the knife in there. As I mentioned earlier, some huge news from Leicester. They've won their appeal against a decision that an independent commission had jurisdiction to consider an alleged breach by Leicester City of Premier League profit and sustainability rules. That basically means their appeal has ruled out the possibility of them getting a points deduction this season for the season that they got relegated. I'm pretty sure that's how it works. The Premier League has said it was surprised and disappointed by the panel's decision. My fear with this is that it really shows that if clubs are able to appoint the best barristers around, which undoubtedly Leicester did and Manchester City are going to do with 115 charges, then they can really find loopholes around the Premier League's rules, and maybe that means Man City will get off scot-free, which really scares me. Over to West Ham, and a little stat here which I was impressed by. Mohamed Kudus, their winger who they signed from Ajax last summer, he has completed more take-ons, 94 take-ons, than any other player in Europe's top 5 leagues in 2024. That's at least 29 more than any other player. Do you think he's a player that Spurs should have gone for ahead of maybe Brennan Johnson? With those kind of stats, it is very impressive. He's not quite as young, but I saw Spurs, I think, were going for homegrown players as well. But let me know in the comments if you would have rathered Mohamed Kudus come into Spurs than Brennan Johnson. Over to Crystal Palace. Their chairman, Steve Parish, has given some interesting quotes. He says, we're proud of the fact that Michael Olise has gone to Bayern. We want to be selling to the top clubs, or top clubs like Newcastle who've got great aspirations. We want to be playing in the Champions League. The reality is that's not happening right now. I do like Steve Parish, one of the very few honest chairmen, comes out and says it like it is. And it also makes me think, could we have got Eberechi Eze? He did some quotes yesterday as well where he said we were very surprised that no one came in at the number that Eberechi Eze could have left at. Yeah, I'm hopeful. Maybe Spurs will go in for him in January. Over to South London with Arsenal. Raheem Sterling has picked the number 30 squad shirt for Arsenal, which I think coincides with the number of seconds it will take into his debut against Spurs before Christian Romero two-foots him out of the game. And finally, some England news. Cole Palmer, Ollie Watkins and Phil Foden all out of the England squad. Palmer and Watkins were assessed at St George's Park and returned to Chelsea and Aston Villa respectively. But Foden did not report because of illness. Doesn't surprise me at all. These kind of Nations League games under Lee Carsley probably won't be deemed by the players to be that serious, but I think they should be because we want these players to learn Carsley ball, Cars ball it's called. I'm very excited to watch it because he won that England under-21 tournament last summer and they played some beautiful football. And one thing we've been waiting for from England is to play beautiful football with the talent that they've got. England play Ireland at 5 o'clock on Saturday. And actually, I'm going to do a live watch-along on this channel of that England versus Ireland game. So make sure you tune into that and I'll talk to you all while the game is going on. Thank you so much for watching and listening, guys. Please do press that like button. Please do subscribe to the channel and also become a member. Only £1 a month really helps me. All the details how in the description box below. Have a great rest of your day. Cheers.